The Harrington estate was the kind of house people whispered about. It wasn't just its sheer size, a sprawling mansion with towering glass windows, marble pillars, and a driveway that stretched for what seemed like miles. It was the air of mystery that surrounded it. And at the center of that mystery was Mrs. Evelyn Harrington. Isla had been working as a maid in the household for 6 months, and in all that time she had never seen the lady of the house leave. Not once. The mansion had everything: expansive gardens, a shimmering pool, a private movie theater, even a breathtaking sunroom that overlooked the hills. But Evelyn Harrington never set foot in any of them. Instead, she stayed hidden away in the master bedroom on the 3rd floor. Every morning, Isla would knock on the heavy oak door to deliver breakfast. And every morning the response was the same, a soft, tired voice calling, "Just leave it at the door, please." She never came out for meals. She never walked the halls. The few times Isla caught a glimpse of her, it was only through a slight crack in the door, a pale, delicate hand reaching for the tray, a shadow shifting in the dimly lit room. At first, Isla thought she might be ill. But then, why did no doctors visit? Mr. Harrington, on the other hand, was the opposite. He was always out. A man of power and influence, he entertained important guests, held extravagant dinner parties, and made sure the house was kept in pristine condition. To the outside world, he was the perfect husband, successful, charming, and devoted. But Isla had started to notice things. Strange things. The way the other staff members avoided speaking about Mrs. Harrington, their nervous glances whenever her name was mentioned, the butler's stiff posture whenever Isla asked innocent questions, the way Mr. Harrington's mood darkened whenever his wife was brought up. One evening, while Isla was dusting the stairwell, she overheard a conversation between Mr. Harrington and his butler. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the way his sharp tone cut through the silence made her pause. "She's been asking questions again," the butler muttered. Mr. Harrington let out an exasperated sigh. "She knows better." A pause, then his voice dropped to a whisper. "She stays where she belongs." A cold shiver ran down Isla's spine. Something was wrong. Why was Mrs. Harrington locked away in her own home? Isla couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The more she thought about the hushed conversations, the nervous glances, and the way Mr. Harrington dismissed any mention of his wife, the more uneasy she became. She decided to pay closer attention. Over the next few days, Isla kept a sharp eye on everything that happened in the house. She noticed that the 3rd floor hallway leading to Mrs. Harrington's room was always eerily silent. No one ever went in except for her when she delivered meals. Even the other staff members avoided it. One afternoon, while cleaning the library, she spotted Mr. Harrington speaking with a visitor, a man in an expensive suit. Their conversation was quiet, but the tension in Mr. Harrington's voice was unmistakable. "She's asking questions," Mr. Harrington muttered. The man frowned. "Then deal with it. You can't keep her locked away forever." Isla's heart pounded. Who were they talking about? Mrs. Harrington? She quickly stepped away before she was seen. Her mind raced. If they were truly keeping Mrs. Harrington trapped in that room, she needed to find out why. That evening, Isla was sent to deliver dinner to the master bedroom as usual. She climbed the grand staircase, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. When she reached the door, she hesitated before knocking. Silence. Something about the air felt heavier than before. "Mrs. Harrington," she called softly. No answer. Flicker of worry settled in her chest. She usually responded, even if it was just a tired, "leave it at the door." But tonight, nothing. Isla set the tray down and took a step closer. What if she wasn't in there? She swallowed hard and reached for the doorknob. Locked. Of course. It was always locked. She leaned in, pressing her ear against the wood. And that's when she heard it, a muffled sound, a faint sob. Her breath caught. Mrs. Harrington was crying. Isla's pulse quickened. Why was no one helping her? Something wasn't right, and she was going to find out exactly what was happening behind that locked door. That night, Isla couldn't sleep. Mrs. Harrington's muffled sobs echoed in her mind. It was the first time she had ever heard her cry, a heartbreaking, quiet kind of sorrow, the kind that didn't expect anyone to be listening. She tossed and turned in her small maid's quarters, thinking of all the strange things she had seen since she started working at the mansion. The way Mr. Harrington controlled everything, the way the staff avoided the third floor, the way no one ever spoke about Mrs. Harrington, as if she barely existed. Something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Isla made up her mind. She was going to find a way into that room. She spent the day cleaning, listening, observing, waiting for the right moment. Finally, that moment arrived. Mr. Harrington left for an important business meeting, and the butler was busy handling a delivery. The house was unusually quiet. Taking a deep breath, Isla hurried up the grand staircase, her heart pounding. She reached the third floor and stood in front of Mrs. Harrington's locked door. She looked around. No one was watching. Then she knelt down and pulled a small, thin hairpin from her pocket. She had never picked a lock before, but she had seen it done in movies. It was worth a try. Her hands trembled as she slid the pin into the keyhole, wiggling it carefully. Click! The lock gave way. For a moment she hesitated. What if she got caught? What if Mr. Harrington found out? But then she remembered the crying, the silence, the loneliness. Taking a deep breath, she slowly pushed the door open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn so tightly that barely any light slipped through. The air was stale, as if the windows hadn't been opened in weeks. A faint scent of lavender lingered, Mrs. Harrington's perfume, Isla guessed. And then her eyes landed on the figure curled up in the massive four-poster bed. Mrs. Evelyn Harrington. She was lying on her side, dressed in a simple silk nightgown. Her blonde hair was tangled, her skin pale, and there were deep shadows under her eyes. But it was her expression that made Isla's chest tighten. She looked broken, as if she had been drained of all hope. At the sound of the door opening, Mrs. Harrington flinched and turned her head slightly, her blue eyes wide with fear. Who's there?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Isla swallowed hard and stepped inside. "Mrs. Harrington," she said softly. "It's me, Isla. I work here." The woman stared at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in her gaze. For the first time since Isla had started working there, Mrs. Harrington looked at her with something close to hope, as if she had been waiting for someone to find her. Isla took a cautious step forward, her heart racing. Mrs. Harrington's fragile frame looked even smaller against the enormous four-poster bed, the dim lighting casting shadows over her pale skin. The woman didn't move, as if she were afraid that any sudden action would shatter the fragile moment. Isla felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. This woman needed help. She hesitated, then spoke softly. "Mrs. Harrington, are you all right?" The blonde woman let out a shaky breath, her blue eyes flickering toward the door, as if expecting someone to barge in at any moment. She swallowed, her voice barely audible. "You shouldn't be here." Isla stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I heard you crying last night, and I—" She paused, glancing around the dark room, the heavy curtains blocking out the sun, the untouched breakfast tray from the morning still sitting on a small table by the bed. "I know something isn't right." Mrs. Harrington tensed. For a moment Isla thought she wasn't going to answer. Then in a trembling voice she whispered, "He won't let me leave." A chill ran down Isla's spine. "Who?" she asked. But she already knew the answer. "My husband," Mrs. Harrington murmured, her hands clutching the edge of the silk sheets. "Richard." The way she said his name sent a wave of unease through Isla. There was no love in it, no warmth, only fear. Isla's hands clenched into fists. "What do you mean he won't let you leave?" Mrs. Harrington exhaled shakily. "I haven't stepped outside in almost a year." "A year?" Isla's stomach turned. How had no one noticed? How had the other staff members ignored this? "He says I'm not well," Mrs. Harrington continued, her voice breaking slightly. "That I need rest, that I can't be trusted to go outside." Her fingers tightened on the sheets. "But I'm not sick, Isla." Her eyes met the maid's, and for the first time there was a desperate fire behind them. "He's keeping me here," she said, barely more than a breath. "Trapped." The words sent a shiver down Isla's spine. This wasn't just a lonely housewife or an overly protective husband. This was imprisonment. And now that Isla had unlocked that door, now that she knew the truth, she had to do something. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Mrs. Harrington's face went pale. "Close. The door," she whispered urgently. "Please, if he finds you here." The footsteps grew louder. Isla had seconds to decide. She turned toward the door, her heart pounding as she reached for the knob. But before she could pull it shut, the footsteps stopped, and then the door burst open. The door slammed open, crashing against the wall. Isla barely had time to spin around before she came face to face with Richard Harrington. He stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the exit, his sharp, calculating eyes locking onto Isla like a predator catching prey. He wore an expensive suit, his tie slightly loosened, as if he had just returned from a business meeting. But there was nothing composed about the rage brewing beneath his calm exterior. Mrs. Harrington gasped, pulling the sheets up to her chest, like they could somehow protect her. A cold smile spread across Richard's face as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet, deliberate click. "Well," he said smoothly, his voice calm but laced with menace, "this is unexpected." His eyes flicked to Isla, his gaze narrowing. "I don't recall giving permission for the help to enter my wife's room." Isla's hands balled into fists at her sides. She had been caught, but she wasn't about to back down. "I heard her crying," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I wanted to check if she was all right." Richard's smile tightened. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if amused by a child's foolishness. "My wife is perfectly fine. She's just fragile." His eyes darkened. "And easily." Confused, Mrs. Harrington flinched but didn't speak. Isla stepped closer, standing between her and Richard. "She's not confused," Isla said firmly. "She told me you won't let her leave." For a moment there was silence. Then Richard sighed, rubbing his temple as if disappointed. "You really shouldn't believe everything you hear, dear. My wife isn't well. She has episodes, hallucinations." His voice turned softer, almost gentle, but Isla saw the steel beneath it. "That's not true," Mrs. Harrington whispered. Richard snapped his gaze to her so fast that she visibly shrank back. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low, warning. "Don't start this again." Again. The way he said it sent a chill down Isla's spine. How many times had he gaslit his wife into submission? How many times had she tried to fight back, only to be shut down? Isla's heart pounded. She couldn't let this continue. "She's not sick," Isla said, her voice louder now, stronger. "You're keeping her locked in this house like a prisoner." Richard's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it?" he murmured, stepping closer, looming over her. "You're a maid, a nobody. Do you really think anyone will believe you over me?" For the first time, Isla felt a flicker of fear. He was powerful, wealthy. He could fire her, blacklist her, ruin her life with a snap of his fingers, but she looked past him at Mrs. Harrington, trembling but watching her with something fragile in her eyes. Hope. That was all Isla needed. "I don't need anyone to believe me," she said, her voice firm. "I just need to get her out of here." Richard's smile vanished. His hand lashed out, grabbing Isla's wrist. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he hissed before she could react. A loud knock echoed through the house, then another, and another. Richard froze. Isla's breath hitched. Then, "Police!" "Open up!" Mrs. Harrington gasped. Isla's chest tightened. Richard's face paled. For the first time, he looked afraid. The police kept pounding on the front door. "Mr. Harrington, we need to speak with you." Isla yanked her wrist free. Richard was too distracted to stop her. Hope surged through her veins. They came. Someone had called them. She turned back to Mrs. Harrington and whispered, "We're getting you out of here." And for the first time in a long time, Mrs. Harrington believed it.